Welcome back. More or less continuously, from the ancient world all the way up until the present, the three great ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and China have been remembered and revered as powerful and sophisticated cultures of great antiquity that have existed and thrived really even before the era of historical records. Lost to human memory, however, for almost 3,500 years is the fact that there was a fourth great early civilization of equal antiquity to those, and which in geographic size may actually have been the largest of them all. It was not until the 20th century that this forgotten civilization was rediscovered and acknowledged, and could finally take its rightful place alongside Mesopotamia, Egypt, and China as among the earliest urban cultures in human history. This culture was centered on the Indus River Valley in the western part of the Indian subcontinent. And it included a region that today includes most of modern Pakistan, some of northwestern India, and even a little bit of Afghanistan. We don't know actually what these people called themselves, but today we refer to this culture as the Indus Valley Civilization. As I talked about in the very first lecture, it's extremely difficult to analyze or understand any civilization for which only physical evidence remains, and there's not any readable written text to go along with them. An Indus Valley civilization falls into this category. Thus, many of the most basic issues concerning it, its form of government, its religious beliefs, its social structures, all of these remain matters of great debate and ignorance among scholars. The story of how these ruins were rediscovered and then really recognized is a pretty extraordinary tale in and of itself. On July 4th, 1827, a disaffected British soldier serving in India deserted from his regiment in the city of Agra. Given that at this time the penalty for desertion was death, he rather wisely adopted the alias of Charles Masson. And he pretended to be an American. And under this disguise, he fled westward into regions of India that were not yet controlled by the British Empire. He would spend the next 4 years traveling around the northwest frontier. And eventually he would gain a pardon for his desertion. Then, rather oddly, he would end up working briefly for British intelligence. He became an amateur archaeologist. And finally, when he returned to England, he wrote several books about all of these adventures. And in one of these books, Masson described traveling through the remnants of a vast city that the locals told him stretched for 25 miles. And among the rubble, he marveled at what he labeled the huge remains of a ruinous brick castle. And this brief mention in his book was the first step on the road to the rediscovery of Indus Valley civilization. Now, not only was the real significance of his find not appreciated at the time, but that site would go on to suffer even greater indignities at the hands of the British a couple decades later. That was a time when British engineers were building their railway system in India, and they were constructing the line from Karachi to Lahore. And the engineers in charge, one of the problems they faced was they didn't have adequate material to provide a firm embankment upon which they were laying down the rails. But, as luck would have it, locals near a village called Harappa pointed out to them these extensive brick ruins nearby. Delighted, the British engineers carted away tons of these ancient bricks and ultimately laid down 93 miles of track on what we now know to have been 4,000-year-old artifacts. It wasn't until 1921 that the first proper organized archaeological excavation by a joint team of British and Indian archaeologists began at this site of Harappa. And a year later, another dig started up about 400 miles away, further south along the Indus River, at an equally impressive site called Mohenjo-Daro. And these two ancient cities, along with many others that would subsequently be discovered, are now acknowledged as the centers of Indus Valley civilization. And it seems to have been a civilization that arose around 3000 BC, so contemporaneous with Mesopotamian Egypt. And it would last for about 1500 years before it rather mysteriously went into decline and then basically disappeared from human memory. Just as we don't know the real name of this civilization, we don't know what the original inhabitants called these cities. Harappa is just the name of that nearby local village, and it seems actually to be derived from one of the names of the Hindu god Siva. Mohenjo-Daro literally translates as the descriptive phrase, mound of the dead. Before really diving into details about these ruins, though, let me situate them in their geographical context. So once again, we have to start with the environment. And the geography of the Indus Valley is really in many ways similar to that of ancient Mesopotamia. You have large rivers flowing from a mountain chain in the north down across large mudflats. These rivers bear with them a rich load of silt, which of course facilitates agriculture, and you can build canals to provide irrigation. These are the geographic features that made the great cities of Indus Valley civilization possible, just the same way as they did in Egypt and in Mesopotamia. If we look at the entire Indian subcontinent, this is really a very, very geographically diverse region. It covers over 1.5 million square miles, but what we could do is kind of divide it up into 3 major and very different horizontal regions. In the north, you have the Great Mountains, dominated by the Himalayan mountain range. Then you have those broad, extensive alluvial plains of the rivers, the Indus and the Ganges River. And then you have a kind of dry and hilly region called the Deccan Plateau, some highlands, which actually occupies most of the southern Indian peninsula. Finally, there's a couple little side regions. There's a thin strip along India's western edge, which is called the Malabar Coast, and that's really tropical rainforest. They can get up to 200 inches of rain there every year. But in this land, in most of India, it's dry and it has lots of desert stretches. And so it's no surprise that water would be held sacred, and that it would play an important role in ritual. Even today, the Ganges River is worshipped as a goddess by Hindus, who have lined its banks with sacred cities, such as Allahabad or Benares. Today, they still scatter the ashes of their dead on its sacred waters and believe in the importance of bathing at least once in this river in their lifetime. These sort of bathing and cleansing rituals, however, seem to extend all the way back to the time of the cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, as we'll see. The Indus River also gives its name to the modern country India, which is also the name by which the ancient Greeks knew it. And the words Hindu and Hinduism and the province of Sind also derive from the very same linguistic root. Turning to the surviving physical evidence, what do we have to work with? Well, let's start with those cities themselves. There would be many more archaeological excavations there, and from these they would eventually reveal over 1,500 separate little settlements scattered over an area of about a 250,000 square miles, most of which are little villages. But it does include several large cities, such as Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. Harappa, for example, was roughly 3.5 miles in circumference and was surrounded by massive mud brick walls 40 feet thick at the bottom. In terms of population, the best estimates are that there were about 20 to 40,000 people living in Mohenjo-Daro at its height, and maybe 25 to 30,000 for Harappa. And that might not sound that impressive by modern standards, but by ancient standards, they were absolutely massive urban centers. The site plan for Mohenjo-Daro that's been reconstructed by archaeologists suggests that it was a crowded, densely populated city with buildings and streets packed very close together. But this dense population and crowding does not necessarily equate to chaos. And indeed, one of the most striking and really impressive aspects of Indus Valley cities is that they consistently show indications of careful, systematic urban planning. The cities are oriented according to the cardinal directions, north, south, east, west, and their streets form a grid pattern, with major streets in the north-south direction and then smaller lanes cutting across them going east-west. This has led to lots of debates among scholars. Some have argued that these alignments reflect astronomical observations or maybe also religious beliefs. But as in the ancient Near East, all the structures are made from baked mud bricks. Another of the most impressive and really remarkable aspects of these cities is the degree of order and standardization that they display even at this very early time. Not only are the streets laid out in a grid pattern, but neighborhood blocks are often of a uniform size. And wells are carefully spaced all throughout the city so that each little district has access to fresh water. And even the mud bricks that make up these buildings actually show an incredible degree of standardization. For example, at Harappa, at least from the so-called mature Harappan phase around 2600 BC, the bricks were all molded in two basic sizes. There's a small brick, which measures about 7 by 14 by 28 centimeters. And this was used to build things like private houses. And then there's a larger brick, which was 10 by 20 by 40 centimeters. And this was used to make the walls and also some public buildings. Now, if you notice something about those two brick sizes, both of them have a thickness to width to length ratio in a perfect geometric progression of 1 to 2 to 4. Those same ratios of 1 to 2 to 4 have been detected underlying the dimensions of houses, public structures, and even entire regions of the city, such as the citadel or castle mound. And again, there's disagreement whether this standardization was a deliberate thing imposed by authorities, or maybe it was related to religious beliefs, or maybe it just arose from conventions among builders. But nevertheless, there is that deliberate plan and order among these structures. Another example of the sophistication and standardization of Indus Valley civilization has to do with archaeological evidence that's been found in almost every major site, indicating that this culture already had standardized weights and measures, which is very useful for trade and economic things. Archaeologists have found stones, which are clearly intended to be weights, which increase in a ratio of 1 to 2 to 4 to 8 to 16 to 32 to 64. And the most common weight ratio is the 16th. Now, the actual weights don't correspond to any of the known weight systems in use in Mesopotamia or Egypt, and so obviously this is a locally invented system. The Indus Valley civilization system, though, seems to have survived even the collapse of the civilization, since an identical set of weights in the same ratios is known to have been used by later kingdoms of the Ganges River plains. And in fact, it's even still used today in some traditional marketplaces in India and Pakistan. And the possible long-term influence of this original weights and measure system is perhaps even reflected in the fact that until the Indian monetary system was reorganized on a decimal basis back in the 50s, traditionally there had been 16 subunits to each rupee. Finally, maybe the most impressive aspect of Indus Valley cities has to do with water. Like all the other early civilizations that arose on floodplains, the people of the Indus Valley learned to dig canals and to use the water from the rivers to irrigate their fields. But they did much, much more than just that with water in the Indus Valley. At Mohenjo-Daro, for example, all the streets had very carefully constructed and graded drainage systems, usually consisting of a channel running alongside the street, and there were underground pipes as well. Even some individual houses were equipped with running water and with vertical drain pipes in their walls. There were chutes through the walls that would lead out into the streets, and bathing facilities would have drains as well. A common feature of houses in Mohenjo-Daro was a kind of specialized rectilinear structure which archaeologists have called a bathing platform. These platforms are about 4 to 5 feet on a side, and they're very carefully and nicely made. In addition to providing for the use of water in a private context, there's also evidence of public water facilities. At Mohenjo-Daro, one of the most famous structures there has been called the Great Bath. And it may have been the earliest public water tank in the ancient world. And it's a big thing. It's about 36 feet long by 21 feet and has a maximum depth of 7 feet. And the whole thing is carefully made to be watertight. There's 2 staircases leading down into the tank, and there's even a little ledge along which bathers could move if they didn't want to sort of descend to the full depth of the tank. Rather than just being a sort of fancy public bath, though, the Great Bath is interpreted by many scholars as a place for ritual bathing. It's placed on a mound that is separate from the rest of the city and at a higher elevation than the sort of lower town of Mohenjo-Daro, and this position is thought to give it some special status. And in general, the prominence of water in daily life suggested by the architecture of these cities and their infrastructure has been interpreted by most scholars as proof of water's important ideological, ritual, and religious resonance. Certainly, ritual baths and bathing, just generally, feature prominently in later Indian cultures, including again all the way up until the present. And it may well be that this contemporary custom has its roots all the way back in Indus Valley civilization. Just like Mesopotamia, Egypt, and China, Indus Valley culture seems to have had a system of writing. More than 4,000 clay tablets and sort of seals have been found which contain a unique set of written symbols which clearly suggest a form of writing. These symbols have also been found on things like pots, objects, and there's even one famous thing that looks like a sign or a billboard that has these on them. At least 400 different symbols have been identified. And usually they occur in strings of between 3 and 20 symbols or characters. But you rarely find any that are longer than that. And despite their best attempts, scholars so far have not been able to translate or even really to interpret in any way this script. And some people debate over whether Indus Valley symbols should even be considered a written language, or maybe it's just some sort of set of identifying marks. It's another problem when we can't read any of this stuff. One issue is that there are no known examples of a text that is longer than about 20 symbols. And that fact seems to argue against these symbols constituting a true written language. But quite honestly, I mean, there's so many uncertainties about this that it's hard to say anything for sure. One area that physical evidence does supply very nice information is about certain aspects of the daily lives of the people who lived in these cities. For example, one very common find is little clay figures, which clearly are toys intended to be played with by Indus Valley children. And many of these are recognizable things. There's these little tiny terracotta carts, which are pulled by little clay oxen, and some of them are so nicely made that they even have movable parts, such as the heads of the oxen can be moved around. Another common toy item are miniature clay models of things you would find around a household. Pots, dishes, beds, tables. Other sort of near universal toys include spinning tops made out of clay or shells, little whistles to blow, and marbles that were obviously used in some kind of game. Indus Valley children, or maybe their parents actually, must have amused themselves playing games of chance, because another common find is little clay dice. The existing physical evidence also tells us something about the economic life of these cities. The cities seem to have had distinct neighborhoods, some of which we can tell look like they specialized in various crafts or professions. So in one part of the city, there'll be a cluster of what looks like workshops that produced things made out of shells or things made out of agate. In another region, there'll be a cluster of shops that obviously made things made out of copper. There are surviving a couple fragments of cloth, including some of very nicely dyed cotton, and this gives us a hint of what the clothing of these cities' inhabitants might have looked like. We can tell in general that the cities of the Indus Valley civilization had a thriving and far-flung trade, or systems of trade, both with each other and with distant foreign cultures. Goods which are plainly identifiable as having been made in Harappa, for example, have been found as far away as Mesopotamia. One of these are some distinctive carnelian beads, which were made by Indus Valley artisans, and some of these were uncovered in the royal cemetery of Ur in Mesopotamia. And there's some Mesopotamian texts that mention various trade goods which arrived from the Indus Valley. And among these sorts of things are listed hardwoods, tin or lead, copper, gold, silver, carnelian, shell, pearls, and ivory, as well as animals. There's a mention of a red dog, a cat, peacocks, black partridges, and even monkeys. On the coast, there was a major port city known as Lothal. And there's evidence of large-scale dockworks and storage facilities, which again is pretty good archaeological evidence that there must have been a high volume of maritime trade going through that city, going onto ships, and then traversing the Indian Ocean. Unfortunately, a lot more mysterious and hard to interpret are surviving pieces of art. The most stereotypical and probably common art object found at Indus Valley sites are very high quality, intricately carved, glazed steatite seals. And often these depict very realistically rendered animals. One of the common ones is the distinctive dew-lapped Indian humped bull. There's also pictures of bison, crocodiles, as well as fantastic mythical animals. One particularly famous seal shows a human figure seated on the ground with his legs crossed. And he's in the classic yogic posture of meditation. And there's two deer below him. And this particular image is tantalizingly similar to later common images of the Buddha preaching in a deer park. And as such, it maybe suggests an ancient precedent for that distinctive cross-legged yogic posture that later plays such a prominent and important role in Indian spirituality. Another very famous example of Indus Valley art is a delicately rendered bronze statue of a dancing girl who has one hand on her hip. This was found at Mohenjo-Daro. And the naturalism of this figure was so impressive and captivating that the early 20th century English archaeologists who found it simply couldn't believe that it must have come from some culture that predated Greek sculpture by thousands of years. Well, by 3000 BC, the archaeological evidence does tell us that the Indus Valley was densely populated, and these big cities that characterized this civilization had arisen at least by 2600 BC. The civilization seems to flourish down to about 1900 BC, after which it goes into a very dramatic decline. The sites become less populated, so that all of these huge, once thriving cities seem to have really just been abandoned by about 1500 BC. What caused this dramatic change in fortune? Well, for many years, scholars held to a theory that there were invasions by nomadic people which destroyed them. But more recent scholarship has started to challenge that long-standing belief. And rather than overt military conquest by an external enemy, scholars are now looking for causes of this decline that may have been more internal. And most recently, a number of what amount to ecological explanations have been put forward. And there is some good evidence to support some of these as being, if not the sole cause of the decline, at least contributory factors. For example, we know that Indus River Valley settlements were able to flourish because of their ability to harness water for irrigation. But the methods that they use also had serious repercussions long-term for the environment. Doing that sort of irrigation for many centuries increased the levels of salt in the soil, and that would reduce crop yields. Also, portions of the Gagar-Hakra River system, along which many Indus Valley culture cities were located, seems to have dried up in this era, and that would have had disastrous consequences for the cities along its banks. Signs of this kind of decline include drainage systems, which have fallen into disrepair, and houses being subdivided. And the settlements that follow Indus Valley culture show a lot of the classic indications of a drop-off in material prosperity. They abandon all that careful town planning. They're no longer building the nice roads and the nice drainage systems. The bigger cities are depopulated. There's a decrease in long-distance trade. And it looks like the Indus script system was no longer used. So whether that was a full-fledged form of writing, even that seems to have dropped out of usage. Those standardized weights and measures also seem to have fallen out of use. And even the quality of stone and bronze objects goes downhill. And finally, maybe most tellingly of all, even those wonderful fired mud bricks, which were so durable that they could be used to build a railroad foundation thousands of years later, they fell out of use and were no longer being manufactured. As we've seen, of the four great earliest civilizations, the culture of the Indus Valley was the very last to be discovered. And it remains by far the most mysterious and ill understood. It's the only one of these for which we cannot yet decipher the writing, and so many fundamental questions persist, even about basic aspects of what was once a flourishing culture. We know almost nothing about the political structure. We know almost nothing about the religious beliefs. There are questions which are intriguing. For example, in their art, there are very few images of warfare, and this has led some to suggest that maybe it was a typically peaceful society. There also don't seem to be any of the standard sorts of figures we see depicted in art, such as priests or kings. And that's kind of strange when compared to most other cultures of this era. Similarly, archaeologists haven't been able to clearly identify even any structures which they can firmly say was a palace or a temple, which are absolutely standard features of every other early civilization. There's little archaeological evidence for political or religious hierarchy, or even a centralized state. And without those sorts of institutions, it's hard for us to understand all the standardization and coordination and specialization that we see in these cities. How could they build such an extensive infrastructure if they didn't have a centralized government? Well, at least for now, those are questions which we simply don't know the answers to. And all we have to go on are those physical ruins and artifacts of what was once a vast and sophisticated culture. Historians sometimes don't like to admit ignorance, but at times, really the most accurate and honest history that one can write is to freely admit what we don't yet know. In the next lecture, we will move forward in ancient Indian history into another era for which the situation facing historians and archaeologists is reversed. It will be an era in which there are copious amounts of surviving literary texts, but on the other hand, almost no archaeological evidence. Thank you.